Senator from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. President, I would like to take this time to talk on the pending legislation with regard to China today. Thank you. In these times of deficit and debt, I think we should not launch a trade war with China. We are here because we borrowed too much. We have a spending habit that has weakened our economy. That spending habit was aided by China, but we can only blame ourselves for much of the economic weakness that the United States now faces. A trade war with China would put in jeopardy a number of jobs from my state of Illinois. Illinois exports to China in 2000 totaled about $533 million. Roughly 2,500 people received their employment by virtue of sales to China 10 years ago. Today, Illinois exports to China total about $3.8 billion. The number of people employed by sales to China has grown from around 2,500 jobs to 15,000. In a state with higher than average unemployment, where unemployment is growing faster than in almost any other region of the country, I do not think we should put these jobs at risk with an unnecessary trade war to China. When we look at Illinois very directly, we can see a major Peoria employer like Caterpillar, whose sales to China last year totaled about $3.2 billion, roughly related to about 10,000 jobs in the direct and contractor and subcontractor related area for sales to China. With Motorola, based in Schaumburg, sales totaled about $2 billion directly to China, impacting about 7,000 jobs. And for Boeing, headquartered in Illinois, sales to China totaled about $3 billion, around 10,000 jobs directly related to sales into the Chinese market. This bill would seek to blame all of our economic ills on a power overseas, despite so much of the weaknesses related to our own overregulation, a flawed health care bill, and too many taxes that are causing small employers, the engine of employment in our country, to hold back on hiring a full-time American. For me, I think that this bill places the blame in the wrong place and diverts the needed attention of the Senate to where it should be placed in fixing our economy. Now, for 10 years, I served in the House of Representatives. And in 2005, during that rendition of anti-Chinese legislation, I decided to form a bipartisan caucus, the China Working Group, with Democratic Representative Rick Larsen of Washington. We decided to bring together the three warring China tribes of the House of Representatives. That would be the Panda Huggers, a very small number of members, the Dragon Slayers, a very large number of members, especially on my side, and the Panda Slayers, who are growing in number, who dislike almost anything related to China. We welcomed everyone to discuss China because of its growing role in the world. Because, according to one of our leading banks, China could be the largest economy on earth, replacing a status that the United States had until our policy was misplaced, and that we've had since around the 1870s. Should we trigger a trade war with the coming largest economy on earth? I would say that we should not. China, in the 21st century, can be the source of the greatest ill or greatest good for the United States, depending on how we manage this relationship. One of the key audiences that I listened to as chairman of the China Working Group with Congressman Larsen were Americans who actually sold American manufactured goods in China. Oftentimes we would ask, is your number one concern with regard to selling more goods in China related to the currency? Overwhelmingly, they would say it is not their number one concern. Their number one concern instead was the comprehensive theft of intellectual property by Chinese entities from U.S. patent holders. This is most clearly evident in the Hollywood DVD industry, but also elsewhere. When you look into this issue in a serious way, you find that currency is not the number one issue. although I would admit it polls rather well. But our job is to actually add employment to the United States. And one of the key audiences we should listen to are people who sell U.S. goods in China. If you delve into the intellectual property issue and the comprehensive theft of intellectual property, you will find that actually China has some fairly reputable intellectual property laws, but they are not enforced. A common thing that you hear about China is a phrase that's often used in the Chinese language, and it goes something like this: the mountains are very high and the emperor is far away, meaning that despite laws that may be on the books in Beijing, they are not enforced in the provinces where so much theft of intellectual property happens. I would argue that a bipartisan agenda that would add to jobs and strengthen our relations with China would be a greater enforcement of intellectual property laws between the United States and China. And there we would actually have allies, like the man who is most likely to become president of China, Xi Jinping, who wants China to be a strong innovator. And he knows that China cannot be an innovation nation if it represents a comprehensive theft of intellectual property worldwide. He knows that China's intellectual property law has to be actually enforced in the provinces if they are to have technological development. His interests are actually in line with the interests of U.S. exporters. And here we could have a very productive dialogue which actually stops the theft of intellectual property in China and enhances the export potential of Americans. I worry that we are diverting the Senate's time from the big game, which is the Joint Committee and its work on reducing the deficit. I have heard that the President of the United States has called senators asking that this bill not come up. And when you look at the prospects for this legislation in the House, you will learn that the prospects for this legislation are dim at best. What should we do rather than trigger a trade war with a country that's about to be the largest economy on earth? What should we do rather than trigger job losses at Caterpillar, at Motorola, at Boeing, in Schaumburg, in Peoria, and in Chicagoland? I think what we should do instead is focus the Senate energy on passing the Gang of Six legislation that would reduce the net borrowing of the United States by $4 trillion. We should adopt the Collins moratorium on job-killing regulations costing over $100 million to reassure the engine of our job economy, small businesses, that they should go ahead and begin to hire Americans again. We should do the big idea that is in the Bipartisan Deficit Commission report of tax reform, wiping out all special interest tax provisions, and then using the money, A, to lower the deficit, and B, to lower the top rate from 39 to 29%. And we should also rapidly pass, as now been proposed, the Panama and Colombia and South Korea free trade agreements that open up new markets for the United States. Particularly in the case of Colombia, the markets would be open for Illinois corn growers. For South Korea, I think it would end the beef impasse that we've had and also open up high technology and aviation markets for the United States. Now, when I talk about the Gang of Six, when I talk about the Collins Amendment, when I talk about tax reform, when I talk about free trade agreements, these are all positive agreements that large numbers of Democrats and Republicans in the Senate agree on and would pass the House of Representatives. Rather than the underlying legislation here, which the President of the United States has indicated he'd rather not come up, which has a dismal future in the House of Representatives, and which directly put at risk any job subject to Chinese retaliation from this legislation. I would also note that when you read the basic text of this legislation, it's not serious because it has a big waiver in it. Even if it made it to the president's desk, given his calls to legislators on this issue, there is no doubt in my mind that the president would execute the waivers in this legislation. So what are we doing? We are probably advancing a well and poll-tested piece of legislation in the Senate. And I imagine that some people would want to take advantage of that dialogue. But have we made it into enacted law? Overwhelmingly likely, no. Are we actually going to take any legitimate action? Even by the terms of the legislation and its waiver, it would be exercised by the Chief Executive Officer of the United States, and therefore no action would be taken. But we would open up the very people that we want to crawl this economy out of a potential recession, United States exporters, into vulnerabilities for retaliation by the Chinese. Sometimes you have to think about the basic principle of medicine when you look at legislation, and that is first, do no harm. As Europe crumbles in a wave of outdated and out-of-gas socialism threatening our economy, as we teeter on the edge of a new recession because of too many regulations, 10 new taxes in the health care bill, and an uncertain political future for deficit reduction under the bipartisan joint committee. Ladling onto that and our markets and the future of our retirement savings, a trade war with the second largest economy on earth would be unwise at best and put the jobs of many Americans at risk at worst. That's why I oppose this legislation. That's why, regardless of action of the Senate, I don't think it's going anywhere in the House. And certainly, given the action and calls of the President to certain legislatures, doesn't appear to have any real future in enforcement if it ever even did make its way to the White House. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back the floor.